Good morning, everyone. This is Pat McParlin from Opus, and I'm delighted to welcome you today to our webinar, First Look, Third-Party Risk Results from the Cybersecurity Imperative Study. Today, we're going to talk about the escalating challenge and, importantly, the opportunities of cyber risk, especially but not only related to third parties. Our talk today is going to be quite broad. In fact, we're going to talk about all aspects of cyber risk. And we're going to share, originally I called this a first look, but it's really the first look at the findings and best practices and calls to action from a study called the Cybersecurity Imperative. I'll tell you a little bit more about the study in a minute, but it's a very exciting study that Opus is really thrilled to be involved in. And we have the producer of the study with us, the ESI Thought Lab, and it's pretty much of a groundbreaking landmark study, and tell you about it more just in a second. And we will leave time for your questions and comments at the end. So let me tell you a little bit about our speakers today. As I mentioned, ESI Thought Lab is our primary speaker today, so welcome Lou Celli. Lou is the CEO and founder of ESI Thought Lab, which is a think tank. Lou has more than 35 years of marketing research and publishing experience. He's helped top organizations build their businesses by engaging corporate and government decision makers. And today he's the CEO and founder of the ESI Thought Lab. But before doing that, he was board director and president of Oxford Economics. And before doing that, he was SVP and publisher of the Economist Intelligence Unit, where he established the firm's global thought leadership activities and created a portfolio of web-based decision support services, and also ran electronic publishing at the EIU and led the Economist Group's transformation into a profitable digital media business. So we're really delighted to have you here today, Lou, so welcome.
Thank you.
We also have Dov Goldman with us. Dov is the VP of Innovation and Alliances at Opus. He's our information security and cyber risk expert. He is an expert in regulatory compliance and third-party information security. And at Opus, he's responsible for our third-party management InfoSec strategy, and he speaks regularly on InfoSec risk as well as third-party risk management topics. Works regularly with CISOs and IT vendor risk professionals. So welcome, Dov.
Thank you. Nice to see everybody here today.
Delighted to have you both. So just as a little bit of context, information security risk is something that we talk about frequently at Opus, and I know is of great concern to everyone on the call. And why is it so important? Just to give you a little sense of scope, by 2021, this is something from the report, but something that struck us, cybercrime is likely to cost the world $6 trillion annually, more than the combined GDP of UK and France. Wow, that's a stat to start with. And as companies embrace the latest technologies and respond to rising regulations, it has become a top management priority, if not one of the top management priorities across industries and markets. And third parties are one of the biggest risks, which is one of the findings we'll talk about today, but not the only risk. This is really a broad challenge. So to study these challenges, we partnered with a coalition of like-minded companies. So the producers, ESI Thought Lab, Lou is here with us today, and Wall Street Journal Pro Cybersecurity are the producers of the report we're going to talk about today. And Opus co-sponsored this with other companies, including Baker McKenzie, Protiviti, CyberCube, HP, SIA, KnowBe4, Willers Towers Watson. So this is an effort we've undertaken over the last almost year, I would say. It's been a great group of companies to work with, and the findings, which we'll talk about with you here in just a second, have been really quite illuminating. And this report was just unveiled this morning, so you are on the phone really the first folks to see these results. So with no further ado, I'm going to turn the microphone over here to Lou, and let's talk more about what we learned in the study. So over to you, Lou.
Okay, well, thanks, Pat. So very happy to be here today to announce our key findings, and want to first tell you about the research we did, because it's been a labor of love over the last year, as Pat mentioned. And in fact, there's a quote here from the head of the U.S. Homeland Security, which likens cybersecurity to a Cat 5 hurricane that needs to be prepared for. And actually, we spoke with Homeland Security as part of this study. And one of the missing ingredients is the economics of cybersecurity, which are still very much unknown. And we're hoping that this study will shed some light on it. But one thing which Homeland Security and all governments and companies have to be thinking about is the equilibrium of the risk, which is how do you make sure that your company has a greater incentive to manage risk than the bad guys have to break in. And finding that balance for government is very, very important. And that's where, we've been trying to help the Homeland Security. But let me tell you about this research. So first of all, it is a very comprehensive study. I don't think there has been a study of this rigor done on cybersecurity. First of all, we did a benchmarking tool of 1,300 companies around the world. And we focused on executives with knowledge of cybersecurity so that we could do more than just understand their practices and investments, but actually their performance results, which has not really been undertaken. As many of you know, cybersecurity is a bit of a well-kept secret within companies. They don't really share information that easily, and certainly not across industries. So we wanted to get that benchmark analysis for the basis of our research. We also had a brilliant advisory board of experts. All the sponsors that Pat mentioned before were on our committee, but we also had other companies from around different sectors. So we had people like Jason Harrell from the DTCC, and we had folks from Fidelity and from Capital One, and a whole range of great organizations that gave us advice. And those were CISOs and consultants. And then we did in-depth interviews, because cybersecurity is probably as much of an art as it is a science. And understanding exactly the state of the art is important. And so we talked to CISOs, once again, around the world across industries. And then finally, and maybe most importantly, our economists at ESI Thought Lab. And ESI Thought Lab is a economic research and firm and think tank, and we have about 100 economists that do macro and micro economists. We gave them the task to try to help us understand the ROI and cost benefits of cybersecurity. And we did something which hasn't been done yet. We work with the NIST folks, the National Institute for Standards and Technologies, to try to understand the economic impact of applying NIST. How would it affect performance and risk? Okay, so that's the research that we've done. And just to give you a little bit about the benchmarking survey, some information, it was across companies of all sizes, as you can see there, from 250 million all the way up to over 50 billion. And then on the regional side, it was companies from Europe, Asia Pacific, US, Canada, and Latin America. And if you look at it from an ownership point of view, we had publicly held companies, also privately held companies, and even some government entities and NGOs. So basically the whole gamut. And we originally set out to look at just the financial industry, but many of the advisors said, you really should cover the key industries around the world. So we did life sciences, consumer markets, technology, financial services, manufacturing, energy, utilities, insurance, even platform companies, which of course, as you might imagine, are probably the best equipped to deal with cybersecurity, but they also have the greatest incentive to do so, since they're under attack. And Facebook is just one of many horror stories in that field. Then we also talked to different executive functions. Yes, we focused heavily on the CISOs, but keep in mind, there is no one way that companies organize. It's still, one CISO said, being a CISO is sort of like being the unwanted person at a barbecue. That's what Matthew Johnson told me from Willis. And what it is it's looking for a home. So you have CISOs, many companies do, but in some cases, operational people are involved. Even the CEO might be heavily involved, and privacy officers. So when we did the benchmarking, we talked with the person who had the ultimate responsibility for cybersecurity, and I'll show you who they are in a little bit. So the first thing I want to say is that, and as you all know, the risk landscape is evolving very, very quickly. I mean, that's one of the biggest challenges with doing economics and best practice. As soon as you come up with a best practice, it's already out of date because you're in an arms race with the hackers. And in the words of Kevin Mitnick, who was a former hacker, now works at KnowBe4, but was in prison 10 years for hacking. He said to me, you know, Lou, we're in an arms race and we're losing. And he said another thing. He's tested thousands of companies. There's always a way in. You have to assume a breach. And then he did something very disturbing. He breached my account while I was on the phone. So it is true what they say. So if you go to the next slide.
You have to close.
Okay, I have to close the poll.
Okay, so very interesting to see what you said. Now, we broke it down even more finely. We looked at the threat actors internally and the threat actors externally. What's most interesting is that the biggest threat lies within. It's the untrained general staff. It's very hard, and as Dov was saying, when you're a big company and you have 10,000, 100,000 employees, you just have to be one that make a mistake and they can come right in. I mean, when I talk to Kevin Mitnick, and they come in all different ways. It's not just through technology. They come in by deceiving people to do things. Kevin Mitnick talked about a big problem where he pretended that he was the new kid in the technology team. He got the HR director to believe that he's setting up a new system for HR and to put all the data in the new system, which he did, and he had all the data. Now, of course, he didn't do this as a crime. He did this as a test. But you could see there's always ways in, and it's not always technology. Sometimes it's done that way. So you got a few choices with untrained general staff. It's one of the reasons that external is high too, because they're symbiotically connected, right? If you have untrained staff, well then it's going to make it easy for hackers to get in and cyber criminals, and for them to send phishing emails that you click on. So it's tricky, but untrained came out number one, and there are two ways of dealing with that, basically training them, although it's hard to train everyone and do that regularly. So technology helps too, and it's the combination that seems to be the best way of going about it. And do you have any comment on that?
No, I'm just looking at the statistics. It's interesting that partners, vendors, and suppliers are considered part of the external threat landscape when in a modern enterprise, which is largely increasingly outsourced, they're not external. They're part of your business.
That's right.
And I would think that if we look at this holistically, the untrained general staff, well, that's about our partners as much as it is about our own people. And that's harder to work on. How do you make sure that your partners, your vendors, your suppliers are actually training their staff? That's
exactly.
something you have to look at, you have to enforce.
That's very tricky, and we're going to talk about that in a moment. But you see, a lot of it is, it's not just cyber criminals who have a great incentive, as we were talking about before. Their incentive, of course, is to find that one vulnerability and then capitalize on it. But it's unsophisticated hackers. They're doing a lot, and hacktivists, and certainly for the leading organizations that we surveyed. What was interesting in this slide is that government-sponsored hackers came out lower, and you hear a lot about government-sponsored hackers, and of course, certainly in America, there's been a few big stories just recently, but companies are not as concerned with that right now, and that could be a mistake.
Or it may just be because they realize that the resources that a state criminal can field. There's no way a modern business enterprise can defend against that. You have to rely on the help of your state for defenses, because it's overwhelming force against your defenses.
The only exception that we found was platform companies who have a very big digital footprint and who are concerned a bit more. And companies in certain countries, like South Korean companies, were very concerned, I guess, because of the proximity to North Korea.
And China.
And China, exactly. We'll move to the next. And we have another survey for you to fill out, and I'll pass it on to Pat.
Great. So our next question is, which areas of your organization's IT infrastructure do you believe are most vulnerable to cyber risk? So in this case, it's not just internal, external. We're going to give you a number of different answers. So Carol Ann, if you could open up the poll, we'll give you a minute or two to vote. And yeah, so the votes are going to be coming in for a minute or so here.
Okay.
It's interesting, the discussion you're just having about internal versus external. I saw the quote on the screen about people, and that seems to be the common denominator across both the internal and the external, was all people. So I looked across the categories.
Yeah. It's one of the reasons behavior analytics is rising to the forefront.
Yes. What I find striking, having been in the IT business more decades than I'm willing to admit, because then you know my age, is the prevalence of tools like this, where I remember when I came into this business, none of this existed, and therefore the risks were significantly less. Paper and pencil are a lot less vulnerable than something that's online and can be digitally stolen. So
It's a really good point, though, because the other thing that we found in this study, as we're waiting for the results to come in, is that you have to pace your cybersecurity program at the same speed of your digital transformation program. It's very funny, because the faster you do digital transformation, if you don't have the cybersecurity in place, but you're putting in some of these tools like an open platform, and you're putting in lots of artificial intelligence and other mechanisms that actually can open up your company to greater risk. So what's funny is that we found that as if you're a digital leader and you're just a beginner at cybersecurity, your probability of a risk of $1 million or more is something like 25%. If you become a leader in cybersecurity at the same time, it goes down to 17%. So the thing is, it exposes you to great risk, digital technology. And what's happening in some companies, and one of the worst offenders are technology companies at a very high probability of risk, because their engineers are pumping out new tools, going to market with them, but not having the cybersecurity done at the same time that they're engineering the products, which is a weakness. Anyway, we've got the numbers. So data sharing with suppliers, 64%. New technologies and devices, 26%. Shadow IT, 32%. Enterprise mobile connectivity, 18%. This is very much in line with what we found. So why don't they show what we found when we surveyed 2,000 around the world. So like you said, go to the next slide after that. Yep, okay. So what we found is data sharing with suppliers. You said 64%, our study was worldwide, it said 57%, but it's the same point. It's far and away the number one concern. And this is a very important point, similar to the one I was just making. Not only are companies digitally transforming themselves, which are opening them up to risk, but they're also tapping the ecosystem to do so. And that's an ecosystem of suppliers, tech companies. The most advanced companies in our survey have open platforms. They're embedding APIs in real time. And when you do that, you obviously have much greater vulnerability. And that's that data sharing that you see there. And then just the new technology and devices, that's another very big exposure. I mean, the perimeter is disappearing in a company as they become global and completely digitally empowered, and using technologies like IoT that connect all different devices. It just adds a multiple of vulnerabilities. And you're smiling, Dov. What do you see in these statistics?
Because I hear from customers examples of IoT. Well, nobody thinks of it. I heard of a breach that came through an aquarium.
An aquarium.
An internet-connected aquarium sitting in the middle of a bank's offices, and that's how the hackers got in. So who's thinking we have to harden the aquarium against hackers? But you have to. It's part of your infrastructure, and it's a way in. Somebody's going to find out how to exploit it.
And you know what? That's a really good example. It reminds me of something that the SIA talked about, the Security Industry Association. They said you can't manage cyber security in a silo. You should do it in connection with physical security. In fact, some of the companies in this study are combining security with the old security function with cybersecurity. Why? Because of that example you just gave. Because the best way maybe to break into a computer is to break into the office. And the best way to break into an office is really knowing how to break into a computer. And so it all gets converged.
And the security people, the physical security people, have the instincts. They're used to thinking about what can go wrong, and they're used to thinking about the baser parts of human thought as to how somebody will, A, if you're a hacker, figure out how to get in, and B, if you're a normal human being, a normal employee of the company, how you're not thinking about all the possibilities. They're thinking about them all the time.
Yeah. And that's another thing which they said, you know, a lot of smaller companies, and you'll see this in the study, are very exposed. Large companies have invested heavily, but the smaller companies and startup companies actually are the most exposed. They're not even using the NIST framework that we're going to show in a little while. And what they think is safe comfort is that, oh, well, too small, people won't break into us. But folks are just looking at vulnerabilities across different kinds of companies and platforms. If they find a vulnerability and you're a smaller company, they'll still figure out a way to rip you off.
And many smaller companies are vectors for attacks on many larger companies. The mother of all breaches, the Target breach, happened through a very small company, Fazio Brothers. It's a legend, and we talk about it all the time, but it's an abject lesson in what you have to really do right, because if you do it wrong, you don't get another chance.
It's the issue that came up when I was speaking with Homeland Security, because for the government, they're relying on lots of small providers in their own supply chain. And, you know, and this is problematic for companies. I talked to the CISO of Lockheed and Raytheon. It's a huge issue. So, you know, you might have the best security, but if you're working with a supply chain and small companies that don't have it, that's the way in. So it's really a challenge. Anyway, and then it's also shadow IT, which came out high in the people that are the attendees of this meeting, came out pretty high here too, particularly for platform companies, technology companies that have a lot of smart technologists setting up their own parallel systems that are not protected.
You know, we in marketing are considered one of the key offenders in that area.
Right? Okay. Well, I hope there are no hackers on the phone. Okay. The road to cybersecurity excellence. Let's talk about that. So we used the NIST framework as our roadmap. Now, there are other frameworks and all around the world, but we used the NIST framework because they were willing to work with us and help us, because they wanted to see the impact of the NIST framework on performance. Because although it's a great framework for communication and for thinking about cybersecurity, it hasn't been proven yet that it actually drives ROI.
We've actually seen some statistics that show that adherence to the NIST framework do have a lower incidence of breach than adherence to other frameworks. And I don't think we know why, but my intuition would be that NIST elevates cybersecurity to a business concern. NIST is not about technology. It's all about a common, the way I see it, a common language for discussing cybersecurity risk. And that's very important, that you de-technify it and you enable people who are in a business decision making role to understand and to be part of the team that actually guards the store.
Well, I think you're right, because in this framework, first of all, it's common sense. And I've worked on risk even before cyber security risk and economic risk and country risk. And it's the same 5 things. You want to identify the risk and what's at risk, and you have to do that with cybersecurity. What are the core assets? Where are your vulnerabilities? You have to set up a protection system. You want a detection system, and you need to know how you're going to respond and recover. And so it's just common sense. And if you do those things well, you have a roadmap. And as you said, you have a vehicle to communicate with senior management, which is very valuable. But as you said, we found a correlation between applying the NIST framework and reducing probabilities and cost as well. And so we're going to be doing more work after this project, but we did find that. And I'll show you how we did it. What we did, just so everybody knows, we took the NIST framework as part of our benchmarking tool, which are those 5 areas: identify, protect, detect, respond, and recover. And we benchmarked the 2000. It wasn't 2000, 1300. We benchmarked the 1300 companies by where they were, their progress on a 0 to 4, against a whole range of items prescribed under each of the 5 categories. And then we were able to see whether in the application of NIST, whether they were beginning, more maturing and intermediate, or whether they were very advanced in the application of all the key points prescribed by NIST. Okay, and that's how we did our research. And I'll show you some of the results of that as we go through this presentation. So this is just a slide that gives you a quick thumbnail on the progress against the NIST framework. Now, we just picked out here the top 7 areas of progress and the bottom 7. And we also showed you which bucket they fall under: protect, respond, detect, and so forth. So limit access to physical and logical assets to authorize using the device. That came out pretty high, 40% of people doing it, more or less. Analyze incidents to ensure effective response and recovery, 39%. Monitor information systems and assets to identify cybersecurity events, 36%. So you can see some of the things that the companies in general are making the most progress. This varies by industry, by the way, in size. Now, look at some of the bottom 7, and that's kind of interesting. For one thing, there are 3 areas of identify that are low. Now, identify is typically one of the first things you do. You want to make sure you identify the risk and vulnerabilities. But folks haven't done that as well as they probably need to. And the other one, which really jumps out at me, is the one that relates to the second one, train staff and partners in cybersecurity awareness, 17%. We just talked about untrained staff is the biggest vulnerability for companies. We just talked about the coming ecosystem and all the risk with suppliers and partners, but yet the training is so minimal. So that risk is not getting shut down. And I would recommend that training is one thing that you focus on.
So I think that the last line on the right-hand side correlates well to what we see in the news today, recent Facebook and Google breaches, where I think they fumbled on a lot of levels. They fumbled their response. I think that this is an area where industry has yet to come up with best practices and implement best practices as to how to deal with the breach and how to deal with it in terms of the human costs to its customers and to respond in a way that customers appreciate. Because they all have egg on their faces today. Too many companies that are big in the data business don't look so good because they're not doing this well.
I think you're right. And as a matter of fact, the next slide, I think, illustrates that point, Dov. We have a slide that shows how they're all, do you have the slide? Let me just see if, no, that slide is not there now. Well, there was a slide that showed where they're investing in NIST. And what they're doing is they're investing most heavily in protect, okay? There's a reason for that. They want to protect because if there's a big break-in, they could lose their jobs, and there's a lot of egg on their face. And so they're doing that, and they're investing even more in the future, okay? What they aren't investing in right now as much is in recovery and response.
Yeah, but I think what was heartening, and I do remember the slide you're talking about, is that the investment in respond and recover is growing.
That's right.
Companies have identified those as key areas that they have to focus on.
And I heard that again and again in talking with people. They said, look, we have to focus on protect. You start with protect and identify. But it's very important that you have your remediation, right? Because no matter how much protection you do, you never have 100% protection. There's always a way in, as we talked about the Mitnick quote. And so you have to be prepared for it. And if you handle it well, shut it down well, respond well to your clients, you actually can improve your relationship with your customers, and your shareholder value can come back very quickly. And if you don't, like Equifax and some of those other ones, it can be a bigger problem.
I imagine that in the future that your ability as a company to handle a breach well may be considered a very, very crucial part of your reputation going forward.
Right.
Because people know that there's going to be breaches. They see it all over the place. But when you respond honestly, admit you had a breach, and in a rational way make your customers whole, I think that that's going to have a tremendously positive reputational impact going forward. Because nobody was ready to give up their smartphones. They're not ready to give up online access to their bank accounts. They're not going to do that. The convenience is too great, but they want to see that the company that's helping them in those areas recognizes their needs as data subjects, to use the term from the European GDPR regulation.
Yes, and I think it's a good point. I think a lot of consumers around the world are getting used to cyber attacks. We did a survey of consumers and citizens around the world, and many of them have gone through it already. But and you probably all around the phone have had where, you know, your credit card company calls you up and said, there, you know, somebody came in from India and we're not quite sure why. Did you do this? And people like that. They feel confident. They know it's going to happen. It's like a hurricane. It's like a storm, like the weather. It's not predictable and it's going to happen. But to know that you have a company that will stand by you and support you and manage it well is really important. And it actually can add to customer engagement.
And it's interesting that the credit card industry is truly a leader in this area. They were among the first to create a framework, PCI DSS,
Right.
12 controls that are very well respected, and people feel it because you trust that your credit card is going to take care of you. They're going to call you, did you charge this? And you know when you say, no, I didn't charge it, they're going to take that charge off your account.
That's right.
So they have figured out how to respond. We all should be learning from that success.
Right. That is absolutely right.
I just want to make one comment before you move on. Lou, this study is far more comprehensive than we could go through in an hour. So there are whole sections that we're skipping. So I just want to let people in the audience know that they're going to get a copy of the whole report, and I'll go over that at the end. But just so all the folks know, that there are whole segments that Lou is not going into, that you will get a copy of the whole study.
In fact, that's a good point. And also, there are even some benchmarks of investments and results broken out by industry that can be very valuable, because one of the things that you should do, one of the first things you should do in your cybersecurity journey is see not just how you compare within this framework, but how you compare with your peers, because you don't want to be behind the herd.
Yep.
Okay.
Yes, I just want to reference that since you referenced a couple other findings that are not in here. So
let's talk about organization, because that's a work in progress, because people are still finding the right way to organize. And it's being changed by what Doug was talking about before, which is GDPR and new regulations that require privacy. And, you know, the demarcation between cybersecurity and privacy and information security, it's all starting to blur. And so, you know, and we're seeing that in the way companies are organized. So why don't I take you through some of the key findings? First of all, you know, there's a few key points to keep in mind. One point, which isn't on this slide, but it's important to keep in mind, is that, you know, cybersecurity is a team sport. If you're handling it just in a silo, you're probably not doing a good job. It has to be on the mind of everybody in your company, and you have to organize in a way that you're going to ensure that technologists and cybersecurity specialists are working with business people, like we said before, that the cybersecurity people are working with the security people, and that the data privacy people are working with the cybersecurity people. You've got to get all those linkages, particularly if you're a large company. Now, what we found is that we're starting to see the rise of cybersecurity, what we call a chief privacy officer or a data protection officer in lots of companies, particularly big ones and ones where it's mandated, for example, in Europe with GDPR. And so basically what we're saying, though, is that some of these companies are actually combining the roles of chief privacy officer with chief security and cybersecurity officer, because they're seeing that that should be put together. And in fact, some of them are taking the CISO role out of the technology department and moving it into a more neutral department, reporting up to the CEO, for example, or the board.
Yeah.
So you see a lot of change going on. What we found here is that 14% of firms that we surveyed are making their chief privacy officer or data protection officer responsible for cybersecurity. We talked to Intel, for example. They did it that way. And it's happening with large companies. You see in revenue there, 37% of the large companies actually have combined the roles or really aligned them very closely. And then with cybersecurity maturity, it's more the leaders in cybersecurity are moving in that direction. And then by region, you could see it's pretty even, although Latin America tends to be a little bit behind in technology use, they're behind in cybersecurity. So if you move to the next slide, Pat, it's this rise of the data protection officer, which we found kind of interesting. And Mike Engel, who is the CTO of Opus, told us, the GDPR requires many firms to have a data protection officer. Now, all of a sudden, you have a person that's responsible for data privacy reporting to the board, and then you have this dichotomy with the CISO, and some companies are trying to close that up and figure out how to bring it together. But as our friend from Protiviti mentioned, you got to be careful with that, because under GDPR, you have to make sure that the data protection officer is a role that's independent from the first line of defense. So
I think what Tom Lemon is saying makes a tremendous amount of sense. Your DPO, at least the way I understand GDPR, is envisioned as an ombudsman, as Mike said,
right,
for your customer. They are the guardian of the customer's data subject rights, and they're thinking about it from that perspective. I like the idea of that being kind of almost in opposition to the people who are technically charged with carrying out the security role. They're not exactly the same, because the DPO really has to think about data privacy by design. Privacy by design is all about all aspects of your business process that concern your customer's data. You're thinking about way more than firewalls and way more about training against phishing attacks. How do we consume a customer's information? Why? What advantage is there for the customer? How do we guarantee that customer that they always have access to it and that we give it back to them? We delete it at the point where it's no longer valuable for the customer for us to have it.
That's why I think it's the bigger role.
I think so too.
But so you wouldn't put a CISO in charge of data protection, but you might put a data protection person in charge of security, or at least having a good hand over it, because it is a way that their data protection can get attacked, right?
I agree.
So there you have it. Now, let's talk a little bit about managing a cyber risk. And let's go to the first slide here. So first of all, it's important to look at cybersecurity through different lenses. And, in the past, it was seen as mostly a risk. And it still is, a financial risk, an IT technology risk, an operational risk, a strategic risk. But as Dov was saying before, people are realizing it also is a risk to your reputation. It also is a risk, a legal risk. And then, interestingly, it can be an enabler. It's not just a risk, it's actually a positive for your business. It's an upside. Because if you invest in cybersecurity, you can accelerate your digital transformation. Now, so you're not directly making money off of cybersecurity, you're making your money off of digital transformation. But it has to be facilitated through cybersecurity or it's not going to really work well.
Also, customers who believe that you are secure and see the evidence of that, they may buy more from you. They may tell friends. I feel comfortable dealing with this company because they respect that.
Well, that's already happening, and that's the area of competitive advantage, 15%. And so you have companies, I mean, you mentioned credit card companies, but you have Apple that came out after the Facebook debacle that they're very secure. Fidelity, which is we talked to, makes a big point about its security, that it was rated #1 in cybersecurity to its investors. And so people are parlaying it in attracting customers, but that's not where they're getting the big boost. The big boost is in keeping and engaging their customers, because if you're good at managing it, like we said before, you stand by them, they actually might like you even more and do more with you, and particularly if you're a bank in some of these industries. So it's really, there is an upside to it. There's a business reason for doing it. And I think it's going to become more important as you see people that fail and people that succeed when there is a cyber breach. Okay, and then there's the tools of the trade. And there's a few things to keep in mind. So obviously right now, multi-factor authentication is the #1 kind of technology. And that goes back to cybersecurity is just common sense. Make your passwords more secure.
Or do away with passwords and force people to do a retina scan in order to get in.
Exactly, and do a few other things at the same time. All right, and so that's the multi-factor authentication. And so you can see just about all companies are focused on that, except maybe some of the smaller companies in different countries around the world. Blockchain came out surprisingly high. Now we're not saying this was blockchain as a pilot, blockchain as part of a service that they're buying that is underlying it. But blockchain obviously has great capabilities of keeping systems secure. It's because they distribute the risk. So blockchain came out pretty high. Internet of Things is another area in senses that actually expose companies to risk, and so they want to shut those risks down and use them to even find risk. And then you have AI, which is going to be growing very fast over the next 2 years. And I've talked with a lot of companies that are including AI, and not just basic machine learning, but deep learning into their processes, because AI is perfect for cybersecurity. Cybersecurity is all about, analyzing hordes of data, and AI does that really well.
Much better than human beings.
Much better than human beings.
I think that the best deployment of AI has been as an assist to business, meaning that you're not allowing AI to operate on its own. It's in partnership with human beings who are able to see further because the AI brings the key points to them. They turn a lot of information into data they can use to make decisions.
And that's a good point. I did another study of companies. We're doing an AI study for another firm, one of our sponsors. And the #1 use of AI today is for cybersecurity. Far and away, #1. So what are the technologies of the future? Okay, so the ones that we see growing very fast, first of all, some of these are hardly used now. So 1700% growth looks remarkable, but that's because very few people use behavior analytics now. But it's really set to grow. I mean, by the end of the next 2 years, 65% of companies will be using behavior analytics. And that's useful for all behaviors of not just your customers, but your suppliers, your employees. It's a very rich tool to really, and I think it ties into our supplier point and ecosystem point. Grid technology is going up, deception technology going up very high, you know, trying to trick the people to break into the wrong thing. It's a clever little idea and people like it. One thing that struck me is third-party InfoSec practices came out. It looks a little bit lower, you know, what is it, about 30, about 62%, but it is growing 100%, but it's not being used as much as it could be.
Especially considering what the study determined, that I think the number was 57% responded that the biggest vector for them was data sharing with partners. So that would seem to indicate that there should be a real focus in this area, ensuring your third parties are secure.
Absolutely. So another area that you would hope will grow even faster than we're showing there. Okay, let's talk a little bit about the economics of cybersecurity. And how much time do we have left?
13 minutes.
13. Okay, and we want to leave some time for Q&A. All right, so first of all, as we said, you're never going to be 100% secure. So what the managing director of Productivity suggested is that, you know, you've got to talk to the board and say, how much security do you want out of a scale of 1 to 10? You satisfied with a 7? Because that's going to cost X amount. Do you want an 8? That's going to cost even more. It's really about getting the board to decide the level of risk you're willing to tolerate. And so that's a discussion that needs to be had. Now, we looked into the economics of cybersecurity, and we'll go to the next slide. And this is the missing slide we were talking about before, okay? So, you know, protection. We asked how folks are investing in the areas of the NIST framework: identify, detect, protect, respond, and recover. So and we asked them how much they invested last year, this year, and their plans for next year. So the top blue line is protect. And as you can see, that is one of the highest areas of investment and will continue to be so. It's far and away the biggest. Identify was a little bit bigger last year, and that's because people were starting their journey, and that's one of the first things you do. And then you can see it there, it's dropping, because once you've done it, you don't have to really do it again. You might do it some more and look at new assets if you're acquiring and doing things, but actually that's one and done. Now, if you look at the bottom lines, the yellow and the bottom blue, that's respond and recover. And you can see that wasn't as much on their radar last year. And it's something that they're all learning, that you've got to do much better, because you have to assume a breach and you have to be prepared. And what's some people might find a little disturbing is detect actually goes down. And so what we even found in the study is detect is not a very big area for some of the beginners in our study. They don't have very good detection systems. So we couldn't even use some of their results because we weren't sure they were accurate, because they're not even detecting some of the incidents. Okay? Now, one other thing I want to say before I go to the calls to action is we also looked at this the way that consultants typically look at it. How much are you investing in people, process, and technology? And what should you do in the future? And what's happening is companies are investing most in technology. They invest in people, they invest in process, but most in technology. And next year, they're taking the budgets and dividing it, I think, was 40% basically in technology and 30% in each of people and process. So I've listened to lots of debates about where to put your money, people, train them, hire the right people, get the right process. People, a lot of CISOs come down to, you know, technology is the best defense. It's going to help secure your perimeter better than training every person and trying to keep them trained. And they also think that some of the latest developments in technology, and we talked about them, endpoint protection, deception technology, AI, actually give them an advantage in this arms race with hackers. What do you think, Dov? I mean, you're smiling again, so I'm curious what you think.
I suspect that if you're a technologist,
You're going to want technology.
You're going to want technologists. And I'm an engineer. I trust my technology. I know I'm in control. But intuitively, I have to say that if you look at the winners in so many of these areas, they're the ones who make the security concept something that everybody understands within the company and is a priority for everybody. So I still think that training and investing in the right people is very, very important.
Right.
Even though in every arms race, it's usually a technology arms race. So,
and it's easier for CISOs to control technology better than people.
Yeah, much easier.
Okay, and so, but in any case, bottom line is they're all important.
Yeah.
I mean, 30, 40, I mean, they're taking their budget and they're allocating it across all the three things. And you got to get them all right. So why don't we talk about some of the calls to action from the study? So the first one, the first thing you've got to do when you start your journey is you should conduct an audit. That's really important. Whether you're doing it yourself or having somebody come in and do it, a third party, but you really need to know where your exposures are, your vulnerabilities, what are your most precious assets that have to be covered. You can't cover everything. You got to do all of that.
You need a good tool to conduct that audit, something like the NIST framework.
The NIST framework is very important for the audit or a tool like that, because it does a few things. First of all, it allows you to do a systematic audit so that you know, well, you know what, where I have a lot of weaknesses, the detection side, or I have a big weakness. You run a scenario where you have a break-in and a simulation, and you find that you're not dealing with it well. So that's important in this framework for that. But it's also important because it becomes the communication tool to top management. And if you do it right, it actually puts you in a good place with the regulators, which is very important because they're going to expect it. And I suspect that more regulators are going to impose things like the NIST framework and others as something that's going to be important in the future. The second key thing to do is you've got to build your cybersecurity roadmap. You've got to make sure that you have a roadmap, that you have thought through your implementation of NIST, and that you actually also look at ROI. One of the things that companies aren't doing well is measuring ROI. In this study, we found, first of all, some people just look at some of the direct costs, like from fines, and they forget all about the indirect cost, the secondary cost that can be even more significant, which are the cost to your reputation, productivity, downtime, all of those things that could really destroy your business. And they're not even measuring those. And they're also very often not measuring risk that look at the upside. They're looking only at the cost of the risk if you get hit. They're not looking at the upside that you were able to move your digital transformation faster, or you improved your competitive position. So, and of course, cybersecurity is a moving target. So your ROI moves, and you have to keep tracking and monitoring results on an ongoing basis. So that's very important. Cybersecurity, we talked about looking at it through three lenses. This came from Baker McKenzie, the law firm, and they said first you have to have a governance lens, so that you set the tone from the top and you know exactly what assets you're securing and how you're managing them. You then have to have a transactional lens, how you're dealing with suppliers, customers, and your risk. And then you also have to have a lens at the end, which is the remediation lens, what you do if you do break in. So, it's a variation on the NIST framework, but it's important. Building a cybersecurity culture, as Dove said, is extremely important. It has to be set at the top, and you have to have a culture where everyone realizes that they're part of the cybersecurity team. It shouldn't be a silo function. It has to be something embedded and thought about in all the business teams and the customer service people.
In a way, Lou, isn't that kind of a way we could summarize everything we see here, that whatever business you're in, you're also in the data privacy and security business.
Right.
And you have to make it a priority for everybody at every phase, when you're designing something new, when you're implementing it, when you're operating it, when you pick up the pieces when something goes wrong. it's got to be a priority from the board on down in your organization.
Exactly. Well said. And then you also have to get the fundamentals right, because a lot of people are thinking, oh, I have this great new endpoint protection I can get in, but they don't have their passwords protected in the authentication. So you want to focus on all the fundamentals and get that. And a lot of CISOs told us that. And then change how you communicate. And I don't want to insult anyone, but I've been told that CISOs aren't always the best communicators. They tend to be more technically oriented. They talk about, you've got to do this or you're going to get this impact, and they forget the business speak. Put it in business terms, the ROI, why how.
What's the risk to the business?
What's the risk to the business? What's the value that's to be generated? Okay, and put in because a lot of the reason that people aren't investing in communication is because of that failure. Proactive mindset. I'm being told I've got to speed this up, so I will. Proactive mindset, really important. Assume the breach. Don't manage it in a silo. We talked about that before. It's got to be a team sport. Shift your focus to people and devices. HP, Vali Ali told me, the chief technologist, that every device you buy is a security decision. And your security is, the people that you're dealing with might be at Starbucks, your employee might be working from home. Everything is at risk.
Make sure you buy the most secure aquariums, right?
Right, exactly. And then, and don't make cybersecurity an afterthought. It should be something that engineers think right up front, and it should be something built into your design.
Thank you, Lou. You covered an enormous amount of information in a quick time, so I want to thank you, and I want to thank Dove. And knowing how open you are, I'm hoping that you're open to the offer that I'm about to make.
Sure.
We ran out of time for the Q's and A's. So if the audience has any questions, are you open to taking questions through email? Should I?
Sure.
Okay,
whatever.
great. So when I follow up with the information, folks on the audience, you can send me questions and I will relay them to Dove and Lou if you have any questions, since we ran out of time for the Q's and A's. So the links that I'm showing you on the page, you can download the reports. There are 3 different reports. There's an executive summary that was prepared by the Wall Street Journal Pro Cybersecurity. There's also a detailed report that they wrote, and then there's the full version of this ebook that Lou went through excerpts of today. Those are all up on that site. Since you attended the webinar today, we'll also send you the full version of that ebook that you can flip through yourself. I'll be following up with that by email. And then as always, you can stay current with us on our website.